Blog Talk Radio.
Greetings, Gus T Renegade, Justice, the cows, hopefully sharing constructive information on what racism is and how it works. Thank you, everyone, for supporting the program. I hope it has been worthy of your time and energy. Again, I want to make sure I continue to emphasize this. If you do not find the programs to be constructive, if you're not getting information that is helpful to you, please invest your time and energy in something else. I definitely don't want people to waste time when it comes to racism. If this is not constructive, then I'm sure there are other programs that you can support, or this might even be your motivation to get out and make your own effort to combat racism if my efforts are not to your liking or you're not finding them constructive. So there we go. Our guest for today's program, she is the author of Cyber Racism. Very interesting book. Examines how racism has evolved as the internet has evolved and become more of an everyday, customary part of life. Very interesting research. Thrilled to have her on the program. I hope you all will find this constructive. She also contributes to racismreview.com website. Recent guest, Dr. Joe Fagan, who was on the program just a few weeks ago, also contributes to that same website. They have a lot of great information. The website again, racismreview.com. Our guest for today's program has written many other books. She's been published. She's a professor at Hunter College. Her name, Dr. Jessie Daniels. Dr. Daniels, are you with us?
I am. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate you taking some of your time out to speak with us. For, I guess, listeners who, if they have not read your book or haven't been to racismreview.com, would you mind just giving them a little background information so they can be a little more familiar with you?
Sure. The book really is about how racism has translated, as you explained in the intro, how racism has translated into the digital era. And specifically, I was interested in following some of the groups that I looked at in an earlier book called White Lies, and I looked at those groups in their printed publication sort of before the internet, and I wanted to know if they had made the transition to the digital era. And so one of the things that I do in the book is follow those 5 groups that I looked at in the earlier book and see whether they made it across the transition from print media to internet publishing. And some of them did, some of them didn't. And that's that's kind of where I started with the book, but there were lots of other paths that I pursued in looking at the book.
Okie dokie. I'm eager to hop right in.
Yeah.
Before I do, I begin every program giving out my definition for both racism and white supremacy. This program, the C.O.W.S, Context of White Supremacy, I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy, and the definition I use is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you feel that that definition is accurate, and do you feel that such a system exists?
Yes, I think that that's pretty accurate. I think that, and I agree that it's very unfortunate. I think that, one of the things that I found in the book was, in doing the research for the book, is that there's this phenomenon happening with white supremacy online, which another scholar has referred to as translocal whiteness. And what he means by that is just that white people are going online and connecting with other white people across the globe really around their white identity. And it's not simply a matter of kind of regional pride any longer. I'm just white and proud to be from my little neck of the woods. It's really, I'm white and I want to be connected to other white people around the globe. And that translocal whiteness is something that I think is really new and dangerous about white supremacy online. So yes, I think it's completely in agreement with your definition that you just gave.
Okay. Also, for folks who maybe they have not visited the website or they're not familiar with your work, you are a white woman, is that correct?
I am in fact white. I'm white, and I should say, just as a little background, so one of the things that I often talk about when I do presentations about my work, because being white and talking about white supremacy from a critical perspective is often confusing for people. And so part of the introduction that I often give, and that I talked a lot about in the preface to my first book, is that, I grew up in South Texas, and I had white parents who were deeply committed racists, committed to the system of segregation. And I was growing up at a time when there was sort of civil rights happening in the world beyond my household. And that movement really sort of wafted through our house via the television a lot of times. And I heard both my parents talk in very, overt terms about how they were unhappy about the civil rights movement. I'll just put it that way. But I also saw other people who gave me different kinds of models, for resisting white supremacy and thinking strongly against it. And one of those people was a former guest on your show, Dr. Joe Fagan, who was my dissertation advisor and mentor in a lot of ways. And, he and I are from the same area, from South Texas, but decided to think differently about these kinds of things. So that's my little spiel about being white and thinking differently about white supremacy and resisting it.
You said, I guess I'll give a prompt too. I have found that non-white people, non-white guest who was on the program yesterday, she said that reading books about racism, she often feels confused and as if the books were written for people who are a lot smarter than her. And I've noted that trend too. And I think it would be helpful. I try to do this myself if we could lower our vocabulary. So I think you've been great thus far, but I'll try and prompt if I think some folks might be getting lost.
Okay.
But you stated at the beginning that as a white person speaking about white supremacy, it can be confusing.
Yeah.
Do you think some of that confusion is because of what you state in your book, the fact that white identity is white supremacy and racism, that's what could be causing the confusion?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of people, and and I think this actually goes across racial lines, that I think for a lot of people, hearing somebody white talk about white supremacy, there's an assumption automatically that I support white supremacy or that I'm in favor of it. And so that's really what I try and do, is say, at the outset of when I'm talking about this work, that I unequivocally don't support white supremacy. I think the other problem that creates confusion, it really is a problem that's created by, people in my profession, people who are professors and sociologists who oftentimes approach the study of racism saying that they're going to be objective, and take a neutral stance. And that's also something that I don't do. I just don't believe that we can be ethical and take a neutral stance on white supremacy. So I really am a scholar activist, try and do both those things, both be scholarly and analytical, and at the same time take an activist stance. So I think that's part of what the confusion is.
Okay. I think you are correct with the first part. You saying that you think that is part of the confusion, that people assume that if you are a white person, you are a racist white supremacist, that you support and practice racism. And I want to get to that because you addressed that in your book in several spots.
Yeah.
As you, a white person, are you a racist? And the definition that I use for racist and white supremacist is a white person who directly and or indirectly, consciously and or unconsciously mistreats a person because he or she is not white. By that definition, would you qualify as a racist and or white supremacist?
Yeah, well, I think that we all are racist to a certain extent, I think that and that's part of what's so compelling to me about working on this issue, because I feel like just like a white person born in South Africa during apartheid, whether you philosophically disagree with that system or not, if you're white, you benefit from it, So I absolutely am somebody that benefits from, white privilege, and I think in that, definition is included, sort of a white supremacist. Now I'll just say that I think it's possible as a white person to work against that, and that's part of what I've really dedicated my life to, is working against that. But I think that it's not easy, it's not inevitable, and I think that that's part of the mistake that a lot of my white liberal friends make, which is thinking that just because they grew up with parents who were, not like mine, who were not overt racists or, who were good liberals and that sort of thing, that they're somehow off the hook, that they don't benefit from the system. And I disagree with that. I think that all white people benefit from this system of white supremacy.
Okay. I just wanted to, I don't want to have confusion. When you said we are all racist, you were not talking about non-white people. You were talking about all white people.
That's correct. I'm sorry. I was talking about white people. Yes. We white people. We are all racist.
Okay. I want to check to see if my co-host has questions, but before I did, I also wanted to get clarification. I think it's very important for non-white people to understand, I don't tie the term racist white supremacist to benefits. I think it's very important that non-white people understand that what is called white privilege is a product of the abuse and subjugation of non-white people. I think it's very important that that be linked. According to the definition that I gave, racist white supremacists meaning abuse and mistreatment of people who are not, because they are not white, abuse and mistreatment of people because they are not white. That definition that I gave, you are a racist, correct? And would all white people, by that definition, qualify as racist white supremacists?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that it's probably the case that most white people are in the unconscious category, right? Like I've also done work on incarceration in prisons, and I think that that's one of the major areas in which non-white people are abused and oppressed in our contemporary society, and I think that white people unconsciously participate in that system to a large degree. So I would agree with that part of your definition.
Okay, groovy. I'm glad we got clarity around that.
All right. Okay.
My co-host, I want to double check and see if she has any questions. If you're there, Justice, you have any questions for Dr. Daniels? Go right ahead.
Are we still on? I can't hear any questions.
She might be getting her
Okay.
pen and pad together, or
All
she
right.
might not
No
have any
problem.
questions.
It's okay.
Well, we'll wait. I know I have other questions, so she
Okay.
can she can holler out.
No worries.
This book, can you, I guess, set us up for cyber racism? I feel like you already talked a little bit about why you got interested in studying that aspect of racism. Can you kind of tell us what originally made you think that this is something that people need to investigate, and some of the initial findings that you came across?
Sure. I was teaching at a university on Long Island back in 1995-96, and the first book that I mentioned was just going to press, and so I was thinking still a lot about white supremacy, but I was also very interested in what was at the time a new phenomenon called the Internet and how that was going to change our teaching. And I was teaching predominantly white students, but white ethnic students on Long Island, and was teaching a course called Race and Ethnicity, and I was very excited about the Internet and thought this would be a great chance to get them to explore and do research on their own. And I took a group of students in that race and ethnicity class into the computer lab. This was about 1996, 97 or so. And that very first day, I had two students sit down at computers, and one of them typed into the browser kkk.com and went to a extremist site, and another student typed in Martin Luther King and went to this site that I talk about in the book as a cloaked site. And those two students, just launching off on their own before I'd given the class any instructions or directions, really got me thinking about, how things were changing and how racism and white supremacy were changing because of the Internet. So I mentioned these printed publications that I had studied for my first book, and I had to drive to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Klan Watch archive and copy the printed versions of these online. But now my students in this classroom in Long Island had just dialed up this stuff, fairly easily. And so that really is what launched me thinking about this stuff. And basically I spent the next 10 years or so trying to figure out a way to study it. How am I going to make sense of this? And during that time, followed these groups online and sort of paid attention to what they were doing and saying and how they changed over time. So that's the backstory on the book.
Okay. I want to make sure we clarify what cloaked sites are, because I think that's very important. That was a fascinating part of the book. But before we did that, because I know I suspect Dr. Fagan's work with the white racial frame, I suspect that will pop up. He was just on the program, and he explained that for us. When he was here, I asked him if it would be accurate to say the white supremacist frame or the white racist frame, and he said yes, he thinks that would be accurate, and he I believe he said he even uses those terms from time to time, but he did say that. So I just want to make sure if I'm substituting and saying white supremacist frame or white racist frame, that is equivalent to white racial frame. Do you think?
Yeah, I do. I agree with that, and I talk about the white racial frame in cyber racism and sort of play around with it in a different way, and use it to explain some of these sites. One of the things, Dr. Fagan talks about the way the founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, were, many of them were slave owners, and that really shaped the way that they saw the world and the way that they founded the country. And it won't surprise you to learn that Thomas Jefferson is a hero to a lot of the white supremacists that I study online. And in fact, one of the recurring banners on one of the websites that I study is one of Thomas Jefferson with a quote from his Notes on the State of Virginia, which is talking about black inferiority. So they're not, they're not changing any of his language from those original slave-owning days. They're just reproducing them wholesale as part of their current ideology. So I think that's a really concrete example, if you will, of how steeped in white supremacy the white racial frame is that Joe talks about.
I agree. I feel it is most accurate to reference it as the white supremacist frame because of exactly what you said. Our founding fathers, you don't even have to change their language. You can transport it 200 years forward, and it fits beautifully for the system of white supremacy, which is frighteningly efficient.
Exactly.
The cloaks, and that's an excellent transition because some of these cloaked websites, they're difficult to distinguish as racist white supremacist websites because they look so-called legit. They've got, President Jefferson or President Washington, Abraham Lincoln, sometimes even Martin Luther King Jr. On these sites. Can you kind of explain what a cloaked site is?
Sure. So a cloaked site is, as I was mentioning, there's one that a lot of people have actually talked about, this Martin Luther King site, and I'm not going to give the exact URL because I don't want to drive traffic to it, but it's easy enough to find. It comes up in the first page of results if you type in Dr. King's name into Google. And basically what a cloaked site is a site that disguises authorship in order to conceal a political agenda. And I've written other articles about sort of cloaked sites in general, and there are lots of different types of these. They're not all white supremacist ones, but the ones I talk about in the book are white supremacist. And this was, I think, going into my research, the thing that I found had changed the most about white supremacy in the digital era, and the thing which surprised me the most about this research. So, for example, on, say, this Martin Luther King site, it looks to be a tribute site to Dr. King when you just at first glance. But if you scroll all the way to the bottom of this site, it says hosted by Stormfront. Now, Stormfront is one of the largest white supremacist portals online, has now almost 200,000 members, and is growing every day. But most of the young people that I talk to for this book, age 15 to 19 and very web savvy, they don't know what Stormfront is, And even one of the young people that I talked to the research that I did was to sit with these young people as they click through these sites and sort of interview them as they're going along and ask them what they see and how they make sense of it. And I asked this one young person, she had clicked through the site far enough to get to a photo of David Duke. Now, for people like me who have been studying white supremacy, that's a big red flag. Oh, David Duke, he used to be, Grand Dragon of the Klan. He's, a vowed white supremacist. But for this young woman that I was talking to who's non-white, did not know much of the history of civil rights or racial politics in the United States, she didn't recognize him, right? So it wasn't a red flag for her. It didn't mean anything. And he's cleverly self-published this book about Jewish supremacy in a vanity press that he calls the Free Press. And she was like, oh, the Free Press, I think I've heard of that, right? So it's a very sophisticated way of getting across this message of white supremacy, which is really about undermining racial equality. That's really what's going on. I'll give you one other example of a cloaked site. This one's run by a white supremacist named Frank Weltner, who also runs a site called Jew Watch, which is an overtly anti-Semitic site. And on his cloaked site, which is called American Civil Rights Review, Weltner has a page that talks about slavery as a benevolent institution, that slaves really weren't treated that badly. And it was a pleasant experience for people who were enslaved. And he goes on. And part of what's sophisticated about this particular cloaked site is that he links that site to records at the Library of Congress, actually oral history interviews with former slaves. And that's a very sophisticated way of undermining racial equality and the idea that slavery was, in fact, a horrible institution. And what I found was that in the young people I interviewed, it was difficult for them to figure out what was going on with these sites. Now, the good news is that some of them were able to figure it out. And part of what they used to figure it out was looking at the graphic design on these pages, which is, for the most part, fairly crude. But if that's all they're looking at, that's not very good news for the rest of us, right? Because what it means is that the white supremacists are just one good graphic designer away from having a much more frightening presence on the web, right? But what I also found was that among some of the young people I talked to, an understanding of what I call racial consciousness, a sort of understanding from other sources that slavery was bad, ends up helping them understand these sites as not legitimate. So that's the longer version of what a cloaked site is.
Outstanding. Yeah, I thought that was very important. I think, as you just commented, that non-white people oftentimes can be duped by these sites and aren't necessarily informed enough about racism, white supremacy to pick out, who is a David Duke and what is his relationship to me as a non-white person. Exactly. Very important, very important. I guess one of the other things that hopped out early in the book, and Dr. Fagan, he spoke about this when he was on the program, that racist jokes, and he was saying that this is a core aspect of the white supremacist frame, another way that the racist thinking is passed through the racist jokes. And he was saying that online, this has opened up a whole new backstage area, if you will, where you can go and tell these jokes, exchange these jokes. I saw one on that you mentioned in your book on page 69 that was talking about, I wholeheartedly believe in telling the jokes. I think it's incredibly important. The symbolism of the jokes, I have said, I think you can learn a ton about racism, white supremacy by deconstructing racist jokes and the context in which they are told. This is from page 69. The racist joke was, what do you call an abortion clinic in Harlem? And the punchline was Crime Stoppers. Can you kind of deconstruct the symbolism of that joke for our listeners?
Right. So there's some of the backstory on that joke is that, a lot of times people think that white supremacists are down the line conservatives, and so they would be sort of against abortion across the board, like many conservatives in the U.S. are. And the fact is that abortion, like so many other issues, through a white supremacist lens or white supremacist frame, becomes racialized. So actually, white supremacists are anti-abortion for white women, but they're very pro-abortion for black and other non-white women. And part of the thinking there, if you can call it thinking, is that it really is rooted in this notion of eugenics, right? This idea from a century ago, which sort of fed the Holocaust, which was that people who are not contributing members of society should not be allowed to produce, and that kind of illogic has been applied to black and brown people, and so the joke is meant to suggest that if there's an abortion clinic in Harlem where predominantly black women are going to go, that they're lowering the crime rate in the future because their children would be most likely to be criminals. And that kind of a joke is, I think, emblematic of something that used to be told in the backstage, in Fagan's book about front stage and backstage. That's the kind of thing that used to be shared face-to-face among whites. And now with the Internet, people are broadcasting, if you will, on the Internet these kinds of jokes that used to be told only among whites face-to-face. And I think that there's a way in which we're not prepared for that kind of stuff coming out when I mean white people, because we want to believe that we're in a colorblind society and we have moved past all this sort of racism. And there's something about the racist jokes and their incredible popularity on the web, which gives lie to the idea that we're living in a post-racial society. I'll tell you one other thing, and this isn't in the book, but I wrote about it on the blog. Facebook, the very popular social networking site, has ads along the side. And one of the ads that popped up on someone's Facebook page that I was able to grab a screenshot of was niggerjokes.com. And the fact that that site exists and that the ads are being displayed on Facebook, I think speaks to the prevalence of this white supremacist frame that's still so popular in the U.S.
Wow. And this banner for the nigger joke site, this was just a random ad on Facebook?
Yeah, exactly. And what happens, the way that Facebook generates these ads is based on, the content that you're adding on your Facebook page. So there's a kind of relationship there. So if someone had posted an offensive racist joke on their Facebook wall, for example, then that ad would pop up, right? So, if you like those kinds of jokes, then you're going to like this site. So they're connected, actually. Yeah. Yeah, so it's not only, the extremists, the people like David Duke who are online sharing these things. It's much more the white person next door who's on Facebook, who's sharing these things, which they used to share over the dinner table, with other white people who they thought if they wouldn't laugh, they at least wouldn't call them out about it. And now, they're posting them online, and many other people are seeing them. And so I think that's part of what's creating some controversy and some stirring some interest about this.
How do you know that these sites with racist jokes are, I believe you said wildly popular? How do you know that in comparison to other sites, these sites are especially popular?
Well, I mean, there's ways. There are some ways to check on their popularity through third-party sites like Alexa or I'm going to forget the name of the other one. I'm sorry. There are third-party sites that track the traffic, but the fact that somebody's paying for an ad, can afford to pay for an ad on Facebook, which can be fairly expensive, to me is one marker of the fact that they're very popular. The other thing is if you type into Google, if you start to type in that word, which we now refer to as the N-word, into Google, that site will pop up. So it's as a suggested result. So that's another indication that it's very popular. So that's kind of, so in the book I talk about this kind of overt stuff, like these jokes and some of their racist video games as well, racist games online as well, right? So that's one arm of white supremacy online, is the overt racism, and then the cloaked stuff, the kind of hidden, disguised, not really sure what this is the other arm of it. So it's these two things at once happening together, and it's a really new era that we're living in, with a lot of the old stuff brought in, Thomas Jefferson and that sort of ideology, but then this new dimension as well.
Okay. Again, our guest for today's program, author of Cyber Racism and contributor at racismreview.com, admitted racist, Dr. Jessie Daniels. Very important. I'm a non-white person. Very important that non-white people keep that in mind when listening to individuals speak about racism, white supremacy. The racist jokes, I harp on that because I think it is, as I said before, I think it is a critical aspect of analyzing white supremacy. And I believe Dr. Fagan agreed. He spent a lot of time in two-faced racism talking about that. You talked in the book as well about racist video. You just mentioned racist video games. I found a video game. It was you play as O.J. Simpson, and you run through different white people's houses stealing items. And the last vignette, to win the game, you have to steal the white undergarments of a group of white women. And I found this game incredible on a lot of levels. As I said, reveals a lot of aspects about racism, white supremacy. Could you share, in the research that you've done, could you share with us like 3 examples of either racist video games that you found or racist jokes and some of the symbolism that came out in each example?
Sure. The biggest, I think the biggest purveyor, the biggest proponent, if you will, the person who shares the most of these racist video games online has been Tom Metzger. And he's got a video game online that it's actually got several versions of this same video game. And the first version that you see when you go to the site is called Shoot the Spick. And, apologies again for the language, but it shows Mexican people running across a river, supposedly the Rio Grande, and the person playing the game, their objective is to shoot the people as they try and cross the river, and when they're shot, the cartoon blood explodes and that sort of thing, and you get points every time you shoot people, including one of the recurring characters that runs across the river is a pregnant woman and her small child. Sort of this, so again, the notion that when non-white women are having children, there's a threat implied. And there's a lot of the racist stuff online which is about immigration or anti-immigration and is intended to reinforce this notion that America is a white nation and that anyone who is non-white coming into the nation is a threat, a harm, a problem in some way. So I think that's one of the main ones that I would point to. And you mentioned the joke about the abortion clinic in Harlem. I'm trying to think of another one. Metzger also has, at that same site, has a version of that game which is Shoot the Fag. And and I mention this because there's been kind of an interesting change with the digital era around homosexuality and the way that that's viewed by white supremacists. So in the print-only era, there were few white supremacists who were thought leaders and who were deciding, this is our ideology and this is what we believe, and homosexuality was on we don't believe in this list, okay? And Metzger was among those people that was making that claim. And now there's much more disagreement about kind of the edges of white supremacy. So in the chapter on gender and sexuality, I talk a little bit about, actually the issue of abortion. There's sort of more discussion around, is it ever okay for a white woman to have an abortion? So there's disagreement there. And then around the issue of homosexuality, there's a lot of disagreement about whether or not that's compatible or not with white supremacy. And there's an increasing number of people who are arguing that that's, perfectly compatible with white supremacy, as is feminism. That's the other sort of eruption that's happening within white supremacy, that white feminists are saying, there's nothing, we can be equal with white men. So it's another change that's happening. And so the whole game about Shoot the Fag is not as widespread and popular among white supremacists as it might once have been.
Wow. I thought that was very interesting. I wanted to make sure that we touched on that today because when I was reading your book and you talked about how the internet is allowing for a greater range of diversity amongst racist white supremacists. And you said specifically on page 85, you said that the Stormfront site illustrates another way in which white supremacy is inherent in white supremacy. This suggests something troubling about liberal feminism to the extent that liberal feminism articulates a limited vision of gender equality without challenging racial inequality. White feminism is not inconsistent with white supremacy. Without an explicit challenge to racism, white feminism is easily grafted onto white supremacy and useful for arguing for equality for white women and possibly for white gays and lesbians within a white supremacist context. I found that fascinating, and I hope non-white people listened very closely. Could you just kind of expound on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, there's a long history in white feminism of not getting race. You know, going back to Susan B. Anthony, who was aghast that black men would get the vote before white women. And that tin ear, if you will, of not hearing the critique of racism towards white feminists continues to this day. And there's a real way in which if white feminists or the idea of feminism doesn't include in it a real critique of racial inequality and white supremacy, there's no reason it shouldn't be completely compatible with white supremacy, because then all it amounts to is white women asking for equality or demanding equality in some versions of white men. So sure, white women can be equal with white men in the white supremacist movement. That is completely consistent with some versions of white feminism. Now, feminism, the kind of feminism that I subscribe to, is much more consistent with, what Patricia Ho Collins talks about in Black Feminist Thought, which carries with it a critique of white supremacy. But it's very common and it's very easy for people to take feminism and strip out that critique of white supremacy. And if you do that, then, like I said, you've got white women who are, wanting to be equal with white men, and that's, not at all inconsistent with what's going on with the women on Stormfront, who in their ladies-only forum are having some, conversations about feminism and equality that in a lot of ways could be happening on any discussion board anywhere on the internet. I mean, they're not filled with racist epithets. It's one of the things that I thought was so interesting about reading this forum, is that they sounded very much like, other forums that I've been on the internet, where white women sit around and talk about, how they're upset that they're not equal to white men. There was really no difference, because they're not spending a lot of time talking about racial inequality. They're talking about how they want to be equal with white men. And the same thing goes for, the gay and lesbian community, which I'm a part of. There's a way in which, the move for marriage equality can, if it doesn't include with it a real message about social justice as marriage as a human right, is not inconsistent with, that kind of white feminism, which is just trying to get all white people equal, and that's not a view that I subscribe to. I think that we really have to talk about racial inequality in this country if we're going to talk about other forms of inequality. That if you leave that out, then you are much less well equipped to talk about either gender equality or equality along sexual orientation.
Again, our guest for today's program, author of Cyber Racism, Dr. Jessie Daniels. I hope folks were listening closely. Very important, often left out. I think it's rare that I hear a white person, particularly a white woman, speak honestly about how feminism can be easily grafted onto racism, white supremacy, and end up just becoming something to advocate for white women getting the same amount of power as white men in the system of white supremacy. And it's hard for me to make that statement because I'm a male, and so it doesn't have the same amount of credibility as it does coming, and particularly because you are a white woman admitted racist. I think, I hope folks were listening. I want to actually push back a little bit on some of the ideas in the book. Is it?
Okay.
Am I allowed to challenge
Sure, yes,
things?
absolutely.
Okay, groovy. And again, I'm a non-white male victim of white supremacy. One of the things that it disoriented me in the book consistently, because you were talking about these different websites, David Duke's Activity Online and John Black and folks at Stormfront, these white supremacist sites. And I kept having to almost kind of bop myself on the head and say, well, wait a minute, we are in a system of white supremacy. Facebook is a white supremacist website. All of these websites enforce and practice racism, white supremacy. It's just some of them do it a little more explicitly than others. It really confused me because it felt like we were setting up an arbitrary line of saying, okay, these are racist websites here, whether cloaked or explicit, and these other websites are not racist. And it just really confused me. Can you, am I making sense? Is that legit?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's, again, going back to this kind of language and scholarship and how do you talk about these things. In my first book, in White Lies, I really made a point of sort of doing this work of connecting the extreme with the mainstream, So I would have, what's a good example? For example, Tom Metzger has this line drawing, which was in his printed publication and which made it to the web, of a white man standing there, and then the caption is, white men built this nation, white men are this nation. And then I would, connect that to somebody like Pat Buchanan, who's on MSNBC saying almost exactly the very same thing, right? So really, trying to make the point that, there's a real connection between the extreme and the mainstream. So I absolutely agree with that, and that's part of what I've, part of the point I've made in my scholarship before. In this book, I was really trying to illustrate this movement, the white supremacist as a social movement, and the way that their websites express their ideology. So while I agree with the broader point, that Facebook is white supremacist as well, I wanted to talk specifically about the movement and how they're using the web to spread their ideology. So that's, I absolutely agree with your critique, but I had to talk about it in some way. So that's how I did it.
Okay. I feel like that's really important, and because it caused me consistent troubles throughout the book, because I feel like millions of people worldwide go to Facebook. A lot more people go to Facebook than Stormfront by far. A lot more people go to Yahoo than David Duke's website by far. These sites have white supremacy on them every day and support the system, the white supremacist frame. I feel like it is problematic, if not an out-and-out act of racism, to divert attention to these sites, which are not the refined racism, white supremacy that we have now, where it's not okay to come out and make racist jokes and say nigger and speck and these sort of things publicly, but you can do this behind closed doors. It really, like I said, it really feels like a white person it feels like a racist is trying to pull a slick one on me and making me look over here at this group of racists and not at, hey, all of these white people, all of these websites, everything you see every day is enforcing white supremacy.
Yeah, I totally get that, and I hope that it doesn't have that effect for white people, but I certainly see how it can. I think that that the mistake in reading the book would be to say that I'm trying to let all white people off the hook, and that's certainly not what I'm doing. I think that the stuff later in the book where I talk about Google sort of comes closer to making the point that you're making, but you know, and I'll just concede the point. I think it's an excellent one, and I'll just reiterate that I, you know, was really trying to make an argument about the movement and the way that they're using the web, but I don't disagree.
Okay. Well, I want you to, can you share the point that you're making later about, if it's the one that I'm thinking of that's later in the book, about them being willing to compromise their rules for certain things, but when it comes to racism, they're not so willing to. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Google has gotten into a lot of trouble around racism and anti-Semitism on the web, and they're consistently unwilling to change any of their search results based on, you know, racist and anti-Semitic results. And they're, you know, I mentioned Frank Weltner and his site Jew-Watch. Jew-Watch is actually the thing that comes up first when you type in the word Jew into Google. And there's been a movement by some Jewish people to get that removed. The one concession that Google made to that was that they now have a little bar that appears by that web return and says, you know, this is a disturbing result, we're disturbed by it too. But they don't go far enough, you know. I mean, that's one really small change that they made, and they haven't addressed lots of the other things, like the Martin Luther King site that I mentioned, which consistently comes up on the first page of Google results. And that's important. Let me just say this, because I haven't touched on this, because the young people that I talk to, and I think this is pretty consistent, not just for young people, but the young people that I talked to for my research trusted the first page of results on Google as if someone at Google was sitting in an office and reviewing each site and making sure that it was a good, valid result for them to site for them to go visit. And it's simply not the case. You know, it's the results from Google are the result of an algorithm, you know, a computer science problem that they have, you know, created. So they're unwilling to really address the offensive results in general that come up when they've been pushed on that here in the United States. Now, the minute they wanted to go to China, where there's an $84 billion market for them, they were happy to, you know, shut down any kind of results in their search engine that the Chinese government didn't want people in their country to get, like sites to democratic organizations, or even the picture of the man standing in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square. So any hint of democracy, Google was more than willing to shut that down in the service of, you know, the marketplace, you know, in service of the big payoff they would get by being in China. Now, I should say, since the book has gone to press, Google just in the last week or so has stepped back from that stance, and we'll see if they stick by that over time. I'm not optimistic that they will. The other case that I talk about later in the book is Yahoo, which was selling or allowing to be sold on its site in France Nazi memorabilia. Now, Nazi memorabilia from the Third Reich, it's illegal to display those symbols or sell that kind of stuff in France. And the French government, based on an individual who went through an NGO dedicated to anti-racism in France, issued an order for Yahoo to stop allowing that to be sold on their site. Yahoo refused rather dramatically and said, you know, we won't let the French government push us around just because they have these, you know, quirky laws. We're not going to respond to that. And really went to the mat, so to speak, with the French government, went rounds and rounds in court with them, a years-long battle, cost them millions of dollars. Eventually, the French government won several times at the appellate level and started fining Yahoo 100,000 francs, which is around $200,000 per day, until they removed that stuff. Yahoo finally relented, but they said that they weren't doing it because of the French government's decision, that they were doing it because of response to human rights organizations and to PR pressure. Whatever the case is, Yahoo finally relented. But I think that your original point about who's the white supremacist here really, in some ways, applies to Yahoo and Google. Who's really allowing more white supremacy to be pushed on the internet than Google? Where you can dial up any number of racist joke sites through their search engine. They really are, in a lot of ways, the biggest propaganda engine for racism and anti-Semitism online, and yet they take no responsibility for it. None. Zero.
What do you think should be done? Should the explicitly racist websites, should they be removed? Should they be blocked? What do you think should be done to correct this problem?
Well, I really think that the United States should have laws in place that are more consistent with the laws in other democratic nations, like those in Europe, like Australia, and that the kind of overt stuff that's online should not be allowed. I simply think it should be against the law. Now, I know that there are a lot of people that disagree with that and call it censorship, but I think I just think it has no place in a democratic society. It offers no benefit to engagement in the public sphere, and in fact, I think it makes it more difficult to have conversations in the public sphere when that kind of stuff is allowed to go on. That said, I think that the cloaked stuff, like the debates about slavery, the historical revisionism around the Holocaust, the undermining of Dr. King's legacy, that sort of stuff, I think is much more difficult to address legally. So what I think that means is that the site of racial struggle, the place where it's taking place now, is online. It's part of the reason that Dr. Fagan and I started Racism Review, because we really think it's important to engage this stuff online, because that's really where it's happening. The fact is, Don Black, the guy who registered the Cloaked site, got early on that the URL, that actual web address, makes a difference. It's part of what is deceptive to people about that website, because it just has a URL with Dr. King's name in it. And several of the young people that I interviewed for the book said, well, it must be okay, it's a .org, referring to the ending of the website. And he registered that site in 1995, 1996, which was fairly early in the advent of the web, and people who were fighting for racial justice and racial equality didn't get that early on, didn't register that URL, didn't reserve that name, so somebody else got it. So what that means to me is that, the fact that a white supremacist owns that website name means that the battle, if you will, is not in the streets. We're not at a point where we have the hoses and the dogs as we did in Birmingham, Alabama, but we've got a battle over URLs and web addresses and the stuff that people say online. I think that's really where the battle is going on these days, and I think that it's incumbent on everybody to get involved in it. And I'll just add this one other thing. I think it's also incumbent on each one of us to contact the administrators of sites like Facebook and search engines like Google and Yahoo, and tell them that we don't think it's okay that when you type in the word Jew, the first thing that comes up is Jew Watch. I think all of us acting together could make a difference in that.
What do you think would be the result of having Jew Watch, that site, removed from the front page of Google or other search engines, not having explicitly racist, white supremacist websites readily available online and through search engines? What would be the result of their removal?
Well, I think the first thing that would be a result is that we would we would have a different media landscape, if you will. That's a word that scholars use, but I think that, it would just be a different experience for young people that go online. Most of the students that I teach at Hunter College are non-white students, and when they go online, I don't want them to go online and come across those kinds of sites. I think it changes the experience of going online for them. And so I want that to be a good experience for them, and I think it would make the experience better for them. The other thing is that it would be, if we could somehow get the cloak sites removed, I think it would also be less confusing. That's really the other thing that I worry about for my students and other young people who are going online in this kind of environment, is what they think. If they come across a site about Dr. King that undermines the legacy of civil rights, and what does that tell them about themselves and their future? I think they shouldn't have to worry about that stuff when they go online. I think there's lots of other things that they can be concerned about, but I just think they shouldn't have to confront that when they go online to do a report for school.
Okay. Again, I guess this is why I felt it was such a critical problem for me in reading the text. Mm-hmm. The fact that we've got this arbitrary line for which sites are labeled racist, white supremacist sites. If we are in a system of white supremacy, you're going to be bumping into racist, white supremacist sites, people, mediums all the time. You should expect to be running into these sites as a white person or a non-white person. I don't understand how that would solve the problem. In my view, it's almost like we're going to pretend that we don't have any racists, even though we're in a system that is dominated by white supremacy. I have been attempting to get Dr. David Duke, on the program for a year. I would love to get more information about what he thinks should be done, the problems that white people are facing. John Black, they all have an open invitation. Anytime they would like to come on the cows, we can chat. It'll be courteous, and I will not interrupt. I don't see how that would solve the problem. It seems like everything would just get pushed backstage, and the front stage would just look nice and friendly and not racist, white supremacist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I hear you. And it's just, by the way, it's Don Black. Just if you really want to get him, if you want to get him on the show. I actually totally agree with you. My point would be, this would be, in some ways, it would be a symbolic step. I don't think it would address the underlying problem, and I think you're absolutely right that, it's not going to, I go back to the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is still going to be churning away. That's the biggest, I live in New York City. It's the biggest engine of white supremacy here in the city. I think it's a small and largely symbolic step, but I still think it would be an important one for taking a stand and saying we don't allow this kind of stuff, in our country. One of the arguments that I make, and this is sort of more important than symbolic, is that the United States, there's this thing that I call this, or that other scholars have called the cyber hate divide. And the fact is that white supremacists avowed, now I'm talking about the avowed extremists who sign up for the movement, use the United States and our sort of lax legal response to white supremacy online to store their data here, to use servers in the United States when in other countries there are laws on the books against these. And it's part of what it's part of what fueled the debate between France, the government of France, and Yahoo. I think that closing that cyber hate divide so that the United States laws were more consistent with the laws in other countries would be a step in the right direction, because it would get those white supremacists in other countries to not use our servers in the United States to promote their propaganda. Now, again, it doesn't do anything for the sort of more mainstream versions of that, but I think it is from my perspective, it's an important step and one that we should take. But it's not a popular one. There are a lot of people who would not concede that that's a step to take. So.
I have a suggestion. I think this would be a great step. You talk about symbolic. I think any website, doesn't matter if it's Stormfront, Yahoo, Google, any website, if they are deemed in any way to be promoting racism, white supremacy through their site, through their website, you could get a sticker, a bar that comes up as long as you're on that website that says, this site is practicing racism, white supremacy, and it stays there until all of that content has been removed. That way, every time someone goes on that site, boop, pops up on their screen. This website is practicing racism, white supremacy. That would make, I think that would do exactly what you said in your book when you gave the example of the students who successfully figured out that those cloaked sites were trying to give them inaccurate information and or practice white supremacy. They thought through what was being expressed on the site. And if you had that symbol up there every time, you would have a lot more people investigating and thinking, what is this site doing to practice racism? Is it something written? Do they have, I mean, you would have people really scrutinizing the content of any website with that sticker.
Right. And the thing is, you know, the technology exists to do that. I mean, it's really not that difficult to do that technologically, but no one's really stepped forward to work on that as a problem. And I think that's the kind of thing that you were talking about with the embedded white supremacy, the white supremacy that affects how we see the world, you know? And that's and I think that's a real problem that I don't address in my book.
Yeah, I feel like, as a non-white person, I feel like if I was more confused about racism, white supremacy, if I read that book thinking Dr. Jessie Daniels is not a racist, she is, you know, working against this problem, I wouldn't have picked up on that. But I think reading your book and thinking, Dr. Jessie Daniels is most likely a racist. I don't know for sure, but I suspect she is, so she's probably going to have some racist, white supremacist content in her book. And I think that's one. That's a major one in my view, because I think a lot of non-white people are very confused about that and thinking Facebook is not a racist site. Yahoo is not a racist site. None of these sites practice racism, and they definitely, as you said, they are perhaps the major players in racism, white supremacy online.
Well, maybe that'll be the next book I write, but this time I had to write this one.
Understood. One other thing that I felt was critical in the book, and I did learn a lot. I learned a ton, and I'm appreciative for you sharing your time. You talk, and you've already spoke about it, the transnational white identity or translocal. Translocal whiteness. That I feel like it's great what you talk about in the book in terms of white people being able to connect worldwide to all other white people in this white supremacist frame, white racial frame. I mean, obviously, the Internet is opening up a lot of new avenues for that sort of thing to happen. And even just as I was hearing you talk about it on the program, I was thinking with white Pat Buchanan talking about the decline of the West and the other white people who are saying that the white population is decreasing. I'm sure this is even more important for white people who feel this is a problem, to be able to kind of connect with other white people who might be thousands of miles away. The problem, I guess, I found with it is that the entire notion of being a white person has always been translocal, and I think white people have an extraordinary understanding of that, that it is not tied to any supposed nation or any geographic area, that this concept of a white brotherhood, white sisterhood worldwide has been there pretty much from day one, I would argue. It changes, it adapts, It definitely, some people get pushed down on that scale, some people get pushed out altogether, other people get brought in, but it's a pretty consistent notion, I would argue, from the duration of white supremacy. Am I incorrect?
Well, I think there are a couple of things going on. One is, you're correct, and if we look at like the history of colonialism and sort of the Dutch and the English and that sort of thing, sort of what Joe Fagans called the original oppressors before. And there was certainly a sense in those early colonial days of kind of white people across nations, as opposed to non-white people in all the rest of the world. However, I think that has kind of ebbed and flowed with the rise and fall of nationalism, so that I think that you have real distinctions between white people, and going back to the Pat Buchanan, Tom Metzger comparison that I made earlier, who really see something special about American whiteness, that's somehow different and special and set apart from other kinds of white people that might in another era have been all as one. For example, in the last run-up to the war, there was criticism from France of the United States, and there was a lot of anti-French animosity in the United States, bordering on not seeing them as white. And I think that's the only thing that I was sort of talking about, is that the rise of the internet and the ability to connect specifically around white identity is something that it in some ways is new, because it overshadows national boundaries. And that was actually a big issue in the early days of the internet, people talking about, does the internet mean that national boundaries won't matter anymore? And there are certain ways in which, of course, they still do, but I think that this ability to connect specifically around white identity across national boundaries is, in some ways, harkens back to those early colonial days, but also brings with it something a little bit new. So again, white supremacy in the digital era, it's these really old ideas, hundreds of years old, Thomas Jefferson, colonialism, alongside this new technology and sort of new expressions of white supremacy. So it's the old and the new woven together in a way.
I think it would be accurate to say that it is the expression of an old idea in a new way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's what I'm seeing, because I feel like even if you just look at the census, the racial classifications that racists assign to non-white people, African American, African, what are some of the others? Asian, Indian, Pacific Islander, all of these are rooted in a specific geographic location. White is, at least to my knowledge, white is not rooted in a specific geographic location. The term white does not conjure up any spot on the globe for me. And looking at the flags for folks, if you want to get a symbolic idea of how white has always been borderless, global, if you look at the flag for the UK, the United States, Australia, France, the Dutch, you will see, wow, all of these flags look pretty similar. Color, you have some shifts in design, but there are a lot of similarities amongst these flags. These are all so-called nations of mostly white people. That brotherhood, in my view, has always been there and has always been subservient to global white supremacy. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, sort of. I guess where I would disagree is that what seems to be happening with the internet, it's kind of like, yes, that's true of colonialism, what you were just saying, but what's happening with the internet is that boundary of whiteness is kind of permeable, and so it's expanding to include other groups and other nations, which we don't typically think of as white. For example, there are several, and I can't list them off the top of my head, but there are several nations in South America There are several East Asian nations. I'm always surprised when I go through and look at the boards on Stormfront, the array of countries that have people logging in from them who want to identify as white. And so in a way, I think it's that old idea rooted in colonialism, which is now kind of expanding and morphing and changing a little bit with the Internet. I actually don't think we know what that's going to look like. Like, is it going to solidify? Or are there going to be like a set number of nations or, from which, these people come from? We just don't know. I just think it's kind of changing all the time. But I do think it's that old and the new. So I don't think it's entirely the old colonial system reproduced. I think there's some new things happening.
Oh, for sure. Definitely subtle nuances, but that trend seems overwhelming, that this fraternity of racism, white supremacy, is global. If you're talking about a nation on the planet, it is the white nation, the white supremacist nation worldwide, in the way that they support each other in maintaining domination over non-white people. We had several folks who called in. Are you cool with taking some questions?
Sure.
Okie dokie. Let's see. We have 916, area code 916. Anybody else, if you want to call, the number is 347-215-6071. But 916, if you have a question for Dr. Jessie Daniels, go right ahead. (916), are you there? 916. Not hearing anything. I'll try back later. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe you have your phone muted. Let's see. 404. If you have a question for Dr. Daniels, go right ahead. (404). Did you have a question for Dr. Daniels? 404. I feel like I can hear them, but no question. Very strange, very strange. Strange course of events on the cows. Okay. Perhaps they'll get it together and come back later.
Okay.
You talked about in the book, which I appreciate, the importance of breaking down how that white supremacist frame is almost organic in the way that it ends up invariably being expressed in things that people do under the system of white supremacy. And you looked at language, and you talked about, with the cloaked websites in particular, how they have, I think, what it's called white propaganda, gray propaganda, and black propaganda.
Yeah.
I guess if you could kind of share what that is for listeners, and then talk about the problems in the language that's used.
Right. In communication studies, they talk about different kinds of propaganda, and basically what they're suggesting with these different labels, and those are not labels that I came up with. These are labels that are already in the scholarly literature, white, gray, and black, and they're sort of suggesting that white propaganda, just very crudely, I'll describe them. White propaganda is just sort of kind of when you know it's propaganda, you can see it coming. Gray is you're not sure who's behind the propaganda, and black propaganda is supposedly the worst, where the person, you have no idea that they're spreading propaganda. And part of the critique that I offered in the book was just of those very terms, that they're reproducing, white is good, black is bad, and gray is kind of in the middle between those two. But I felt like because what I was talking about with the cloaked sites was so similar to these kinds of terms that I needed to use those terms again, just to let people know I had done my homework, But I don't even use those terms, and when I talk about the work, just because I find them so problematic. But I would have been remiss if I hadn't included them in my book. So.
Well, that in itself, I would say, is white supremacy, racism operating again, where you might be penalized for not carrying forward
Exactly, and and once again, I'll just reiterate what I said at the top of the show, which is that we're trapped in this system, of language, and that's a perfect example of it right there.
Yeah, I feel like non-white people often don't pay attention to things like that. We haven't been taught. We have been thoroughly miseducated, diseducated. Which is true. I think. It's true. That's why we don't know who David Duke is. That's why we don't pay close enough attention to words that are being used. I think the example with Don Black, get his name correct so I can get him on the program. Don Black. Having an understanding that these earls are going to be important. I think that's a huge aspect of why this problem doesn't get corrected, that non-white people do not understand the power of words. And just with Don Black understanding, hey, having this earl could be a big weapon for us. Non-white people not having that understanding, huge gap.
Yeah.
I was just picking out other aspects of where this language pops up. You use the term fair in your work a lot. Like I could have counted. I try to count when people say it on the program, but I feel like there are a lot of those same problems with white propaganda, gray propaganda, black propaganda, using the term fair to connote correctness, accuracy, justice is a big problem because fair is also directly related to white. It's implying you're not treating me fairly, you're not treating me whitely. I feel like that's a big am I saying what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Do I sound crazy?
Yeah, I just no, I hadn't thought of that one before. That's a good one. I'll try and watch that as I remove it from my language. What would you suggest instead? Equitable?
Well, it depends on the context because it hops around how fair gets used. I definitely think treating someone correctly would be better than fairly. I think if we're talking about rules and making sure that the rules have been observed properly, what you did was not correct. What you did was not just. I think those would be better substitutions. Equitable. I have to think about that. Well, that's problematic for me because I hear people use the term like racial equality, and I don't really know what that means. Because you use it in the book. What does racial equality mean?
Well, racial equality to me is, all those measures that we as sociologists typically use, income, education, occupation, all those sorts of quantitative measures that are so, and health, all those disparate measures where they're not so unequal as they are now between whites and non-whites. If those were more equitable, that would be a step toward racial equality.
Would the elimination of racism, white supremacy, would that produce racial equality?
I think it would be a required step, but not sufficient.
Not sufficient. Okay. It's the racial, I guess, throws me off. When I hear people say like social justice or racial justice, racial equality, the racial throws me off. The term race, to me, that means white supremacy. Race is a social construct, a creation of white supremacy. I don't think you would have racial, you would just have justice, or you would just have equality, where people are not being mistreated.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, it's strange. I don't understand when people use that term. It's very strange.
No, I get you.
Yeah, but the fair one does not. Fair, I try to catch everyone on that. I think that would be excellent. If people could point out why it's incorrect to use that term, because I think most often people haven't thought, particularly non-white people, have not thought about why you should not say that, why you should not equate fairness with accuracy, justice. You're not treating me fairly. Just really try to call that out and discourage people from using it. That would be great.
Okay.
I'm gonna try the switchboard again because more people keep calling, but I can't hear them. 111, you called in. If you have a question for Dr. Daniels, go ahead and let's see if you're on. 111.
Hotep victim.
Greetings, Mr. 702. We can hear you loud and clear.
Yes, I'm sorry, it's Miss Daniels?
Yes,
Yes, greetings.
Greetings.
After listening to the Renegade ask questions of you and the inconsistencies that are coming from you as a result of his questions, I must admit that I'm in quite an emotional, confused, and disoriented state. But my question to you is, as I've listened, it almost sounds to me as if you did say you're an admitted white supremacist, and it almost sounds to me as if you're, in a refined sense, holding the rope or the noose and giving it to David Duke and then turning around and saying, oh my God, David's actually hanging the nigger. Would that be accurate for you?
You know, I don't think so, and I'm sorry that you're in a emotional state after hearing the interview. I just my point in writing the book was to work against people like David Duke, and so I'm troubled to hear that you think that I'm holding the noose, as it were.
Well, let me give you another question. When you said that you felt that the White Brotherhood was, I guess, having different factions, or with the nationalism coming up in different parts of the world, and so it seems as though maybe they weren't as cohesive. There was only one real thing when you're saying you're wanting to fight against this, and you tell me if you agree with this. Ultimately, no matter where a white person is on the planet, it seems to me what they always inevitably know is, you're a nigger and I'm white. Would you agree that that's the case?
I'm not sure I would agree with that.
In other words, no matter what a white supremacist, no matter where a white supremacist is on the planet, no matter where, what they always inevitably know is, I'm white and you're a nigger. Would you agree?
Well,
with
I think that's the white supremacist ideology. Yes, I would agree with that.
Would that be consistent universally?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer that. I don't know.
Well, let me ask you this then. Have you met a white person that is a white supremacist that are from different parts of the world, if they've acknowledged to you that they are white supremacists, and they have said to you, what I know is, I'm white and the niggers are the niggers?
No, but I've read them online saying similar sorts of things.
Oh, so then that would be some verification of what I'm saying. Okay. Yes, it's very confusing. It all seems quite strange, quite insane.
Yes, it's very. Well, I think it's very troubling.
Great. That's what I'm saying. And as a result of the inconsistencies, and I'm sorry for cutting you off. I do want to hear what you had to say. But as a result of the inconsistencies that the victim, the host of this show, has brought out, it becomes even more troubling. But what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
No, I think that I was done. It's fine.
I guess I wanted to get clarity for some of the things that the gentleman asked at 720 here. I think, unless I am misinformed, I think Dr. Fagan, when he says the white racial frame, what I call the white supremacist frame, I think the essence of that is, if you are a white person, you understand that there are people who are not white, that you are supposed to dominate and mistreat forever. I think that's like the essence of the white supremacist frame. Is that accurate? Am I misunderstanding the white racial frame?
Well, I don't know that, I would agree with so much with the last part of that about mistreating non-white people. I think that the way I read Dr. Fagan's work is that the white racial frame is about the first part of that, about sort of understanding whiteness and a certain kind of place in the universe. And I think the rest of that is implied, but I don't think it's always explicit.
Dr. Fagan is supposed to come back with us. Unless I've been misinformed, I think that is an explicit aspect of the white supremacist frame, that domination is at the expense, the abuse of non-white people. And I think even the racist jokes that they tell, they seem to imply these people are supposed to be mistreated. What is an abortion clinic in Harlem? I mean, that implies, the fact that we're laughing about this implies that there's some sort of humor, some sort of entertainment value out of non-white people being mistreated, in addition to we benefit. I could be wrong, but I think, in fact, I suspect you could be practicing racism now and not conceding this, because I'm pretty certain Dr. Fagan would say yes. I'm pretty certain, but I'll make sure when he comes back on the program.
I'm happy to concede the point. I was just making conversation.
Practicing racism, perhaps?
Possibly. I hope not, but possibly.
Okay. The gentleman at 720, I think that's what he meant when he said nigger. That's my definition of a nigger, is someone who is not white, a victim of white supremacy. I think that's what he meant. So I think that's what the conversation we just had, I think, is an illustration of why he was confused by some of the things that were said on the program, which shouldn't be happening. I mean, if we're really interested in replacing white supremacy with justice, if you're really not David Duke, I mean, if there's a difference between what you do and what Don Black does, it should be, hey, come on, let's we need accurate information as quick as possible. I mean, if you all are in the same boat, I'd rather just have that. Just, we're all in this together. Sorry, this is what we enjoy doing. I would much rather that. I mean, at least I know what I'm working with. I'm serious. What is funny, I guess, about this to you?
No, just that you were saying I'd rather know what I'm dealing with. That was all.
Why is that funny?
You were laughing. I was laughing with you, I thought.
Very interesting. I want to double check, because I don't know if the people, if they don't have questions, maybe they're laughing with us. I don't know. 916, if you have because your hand is up. 916, if you have a question. Did you have a question for Dr. Daniels, or are you just hanging out?
No, unfortunately, I'm on speakerphone right now.
Okay.
I got to just listen. I'll mute myself.
Thank you for calling in, sir. Glad we got that straightened out. 404, did you have a question? 404?
Hello. No, I don't have a question. I'm at work, so I'm in the same situation as 916. But I was also laughing, and it's also, I agree, it's interesting. I agree with the points that you made, Gus.
Right on. Thank you. Thank you for listening in. Appreciate it. Much love. We had one person did type in a question for Dr. Daniels. This person, non-white person, they wanted to know, in the work that you do, allegedly against racism, white supremacy, are you working against yourself as a white person doing this work?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question means, but I'll do my best. I think that I work against myself and work against, the white racial frame that Fagan talks about, how we, as white people, have that, how we're raised with it, how we're taught that in the schools, and I am engaged in an excavation process, a continual excavation process of trying to rid myself of that. So, yeah, in a way, I guess I am working against myself in the work that I do.
Do you see any evidence that white people are going to complete this excavation process and get to a point where they are no longer interested in practicing racism, white supremacy?
Oh, let me just be clear. I don't think a lot of other white people are doing that. I said I was doing that.
Right.
So in answer to your question, I'm making progress. I'm not where my parents were, but, I have a long way to go. In terms of other white people, I don't see them doing a lot of anything, in terms of addressing white supremacy in the culture today. Like I said earlier, I think that the prevalent ideology in the United States is that we live in a post-racial society. So most of the white people that I talk to who are white liberals have no interest in, the discussion that we're having today, or in finding out more about racism in any form. They're just convinced that it's over. So I'm not optimistic that other white people are doing much of this.
Okay. Now that's very important. I think non-white people need to hear that. I think non-white people need to hear that more so than the evils at Stormfront and David Duke, because that doesn't really represent most white people. What represents most white people is what you just said. I think that they're not doing any excavating. They're all right with this. They are enjoying their lives, just rolling through as racist man and racist woman with the benefits that they get and the abuse of non-white people, consciously, unconsciously, directly, indirectly. And I think it's very important that non-white people hear that. I think we did get another caller. Let's see if I can get the other caller with us so he can ask a few questions. Again, while I'm trying to navigate, I'm not as tech savvy as I should be at this point. Context of White Supremacy with Dr. Jessie Daniels, admitted racist and author of Cyber Racism. Hope you all have found the program constructive, and hopefully we've not been too confusing. Let's see. Okay, I think we have our other listener with us. He is calling all the way from the UK, so we are getting international participation in the program. Let's see. Dr. Ali, do we have you with us, Dr. Ali?
You do indeed.
Outstanding. If you have questions for Dr. Daniels, go right ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Gus. The sole question I have really concerns some interaction I had with her a while back in connection with mounting a link to her book on the Bandung 2 blog website. Yeah, and I just want to give a little bit of background to that. Miss Daniels essentially responded to the posting I made on the website, which essentially was a kind of early commentary. Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you, sir.
Okay, sorry. The posting was entitled "Comment Cyber Racism and Internet Censorship," and essentially I just come across Ms. Daniels' book and I was leafing through it. And initial reactions about the work was that it was not constructive, that it was essentially focusing on what I considered to be, if you like, cyber racism 1.0, whereas the issue that we really need to be dealing with, I feel, is cyber racism 2.0, a refined form, the mainstream form, if you like. And so I posted my initial thoughts on this, and also I came across a link online to the book. It didn't take me very long to find it in a search engine. And essentially, I wanted to make that link and that material available to non-white people who, being victims of racism, white supremacy, are generally in an economically disadvantaged condition relative to white people, specifically with respect to their ability to purchase texts, i.e. material that may be of constructive value for replacing the system of racism, white supremacy with justice. So essentially I hosted the link so that interesting readers could download the book, read the book, digest the book, and or pursue further discussion with the author. However, I pretty much immediately got a response from Ms. Daniels, number one, critiquing me or challenging me for my rather premature critique, which I accept. They were, however, initial impressions. And I feel, having read approximately 150 pages of the book by now, that my first impressions were correct. They were borne out by my reading. And that the book is either a distraction, a diversion, or simply of very little constructive value for people who are seriously committed to replacing white supremacy, racism with justice. Interestingly, one of the books that I was reading at the same time is a book by Jack Goldsmith and Tim Wu entitled Who Controls the Internet, which Ms. Daniels does reference in her book. However, that book, the book by Goldsmith and Wu, I think is a lot more constructive for understanding what I'm referring to as cyber racism 2.0. And so essentially, it appears to me at least that my initial, you could say, review of the book has been borne out by a relatively close reading. But the issue that really concerns me, and the one I'm trying to bring up here specifically, is the issue of copyright infringement, because apart from criticizing me for a rather premature review of the work, the second point Ms. Daniels made was to remove the illegal download of her book. Now, this is interesting because I followed up her request pretty much immediately with a response asking her that, given in her book, pretty early on in the book, she states that she is committed not purely to scholarship, but also to activism. And so she considers herself, to paraphrase, a scholar activist. On that basis, I wanted to inquire as to why would a white person want to prevent the dissemination of their material, which may be of constructive value for non-white people, as far and as wide as possible. Now, also, if the issue is simply to invoke copyright law, that it's an infringement on her rights as the author of the work, then I think we really need to understand, and at some point maybe even explore the whole issue of copyright, patent, ownership, intellectual property, etc., in the context of a globally operating system of racism and white supremacy, because there's a differential power law and system of power relations at work here. And so I regard the invocation of copyright breach as a form of violence. And I'd just like to hear Ms. Daniels' response to that.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Ali for calling in and addressing this issue, because I think it's an important one. There are two issues here that I want to raise, and one of them is one that's come up in the interview already, and that is critiquing me for the book that I didn't write. The book that I wrote, as I've said before, was a follow-up to my first book, which was about white supremacist extremists and their publications, and this was meant to follow that. And as I said, I may write that other book about cyber racism 2.0 on Facebook and more mainstream expressions of it in subsequent work, but that's not the book that I've written now. And I frankly, I don't think that that's a fair criticism, but fine, we can have that discussion.
Fair, you just said it again. Fair, you just said it again.
Indeed, I did use the word fair, and I apologize. I also believe that the book that I wrote, I know that the book that I wrote, I no longer own. It's owned by a publishing company. And so when I get a notice that someone has posted an illegal download, as just as it might be to give away the work, it's not mine to give away anymore. And so it's my practice when I find an illegal download to notify the publisher and to notify the person who's put it on their website. And I was following that practice when I notified Dr. Ali about the illegal download that he had posted on his book, on his website. Now, the conversation about whether or not publishing is a white supremacist enterprise or copyright law is in fact an extension of white supremacy is another discussion that we can have. And I don't think that it's unreasonable to ask someone to remove an illegal download. I don't think that is engaging in white supremacy, and I believe that reasonable people can disagree about that, but I really don't think that that's what I was doing.
Could I respond?
Fine with me. Go ahead.
Okay. My feeling about that is to paraphrase or draw an analogy with an expression that other counter-racists in the UK have communicated to me previously, and that is, if you want to hide something from a nigger, put it in writing. And I see copyright as effectively copy white. It's the right afforded by white people to copy them and or any of their products. And copyright, by definition being linked to the notion of production, is just another means by which to prevent access. It's a form of, if you like, reinforcing what has been described as the digital divide, although that term itself is a misnomer because it kind of obscures the more serious issues to do with a historical legacy of power relations, asymmetries, socioeconomics, and the last 500 years at least of racism, white supremacy. So although I understand what you're saying in terms of, if you like, some kind of contractual obligations that you feel you have with your publisher, I feel that that is a deceitful act in the sense that you could simply have remained silent. That work would have penetrated, it would have circulated, it would have reached the people possibly who need to be reached by it.
And I think that's a valid point, and it's certainly one that I'll consider going forward.
Thank you.
There was a different non-white person who had a question. I believe this individual, non-Mighty Wick, if you have a question, your mic is open. If you have a question for Dr. Jessie Daniels. Dr. Ali, if you want to hang tight, I can get at you before the program wraps up. But non-Mighty Wick, if you have a question, go right ahead, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Daniels, are you now or have you ever been involved in a sexual situation with a non-white person?
I'm not sure I'm ready to answer that question. Why do you ask?
Well, I'm a victim of white supremacy. I get confused pretty easy. I like to know, and I think it's very productive for the purpose of producing justice, as much information I can about white people who practice racism. And so, please, if you would answer, that'd be very constructive.
Yes, I have.
Thank you. Are you currently now in a sexual situation with a non-white person?
No, I'm not.
Thank you. That's all for now. Appreciate it, host.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the question. I, too, think that that's very important. I just wanted to throw in, I think that is critical because the evidence shows white people have been able to engage in sexual intercourse with non-white people and practice racism, white supremacy. Thomas Jefferson, for sure. And Dr. Fagan had several examples of that in his book as well, Two-Faced Racism, where he talked about white people who would make racist jokes, and then these same white people had a so-called fetish for non-white females. So I think that's very important. Thank you for the question, caller.
I have to interrupt, though. I don't think that that being involved with someone is the same thing as a fetish.
I would wholeheartedly agree. However, regardless of whether it is a so-called fetish or even a marriage or just a regular old boyfriend, girlfriend, or any other form of sexual relationship, that power dynamic, that white supremacist frame is still present, and that white person still has all of the power that goes with being in a system of white supremacy, and the opposite for the victim, unfortunately. So I think it is extraordinarily important that information be shared and people think critically about whether that's something that should be happening in a system of white supremacy.
Interesting.
Very, very. 404, you have a hand up now. Did you have a question for Dr. Daniels, 404?
I'm sorry. I don't have a hand up. Thank you. I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm working. Okay.
Oh, okay. Groovy.
Okay.
Confused me. Thank you. Groovy then. Okay. I will check before we wrap up to make sure that no one has any final questions before we get ready to wrap things up. I guess Dr. Ali, 720 and 916. If you all have any last questions you'd like to get out before we wrap things up with Dr. Daniels, feel free to go now.
No, I think I'm okay.
Okay. It's Dr. Ali, 720. Did you have anything before we wrap up with Dr. Daniels?
One last question. Dr. Daniels, you said that early on the program that you felt, paraphrasing a little bit, that most whites are unconscious about white supremacy?
Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you feel that the number of whites that are going to the sites that you named, such as niggerjokes.com, do you feel they're unconscious?
I don't, actually. I think that they are, let me back up and say I think the ones that are going to the sites like Stormfront are very consciously constructing white identity. And I don't know. I think it's an open question what's going on with the whites who are going to the racist joke sites. I think that somebody should do that study, and I'm perhaps not the person to do it, but I think someone should do that study and find out what people are thinking when they type into Google racist jokes and go to those sites. My guess is, based on other things that I've read and other white people that I know, is that they don't see it as part of the rest of their white identity, that they just go there sort of unthinkingly and then go about the rest of their day and don't think about it the rest of the time. So I think, yes, they would be somewhat unconscious.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. I guess my last question before we get ready to wrap up.
Okay.
The conscious thing, because that comes up a lot on the program.
Mm-hmm.
People will concede that, all white people are racist in the system of white supremacy. A lot of white people have said that, but they will say that I don't think most of them are conscious.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if we were going to be clear in terms of exactly what are these white people conscious of or unconscious of,
Mm-hmm.
I think in order to practice racism consciously, all you need to know is I'm a white person and how to make distinctions between who is white and who is not white. Those are the only two things that you need to be conscious of in order to consciously practice white supremacy. And I strongly suspect that there is no white person who is functional, who is not conscious of those two things, that they are white and how to discriminate between who is and who is not a white person. Does that make sense? Is that accurate?
Yes, that makes total sense, and I think you're right.
On that basis, I would say that every white person in a system of white supremacy, if they're practicing racism, white supremacy, they are doing so consciously. They know they're white. They know whoever they're mistreating is not white.
Yeah, I think on that point I'd have to disagree because I think it's more complicated than that. I just think that a lot of white people know those distinctions, make those distinctions, and at the same time don't realize that they're operating within white supremacy. It's part of what makes it so difficult to combat.
They might not label what they're doing as racism,
Yeah.
but if I know I'm white and I am mistreating you because you are not white, I'm pretty conscious in terms of why I'm doing what I'm doing, how I am relating to you. And in fact, I would just say that racist jokes, I don't think you can tell those jokes and really understand those jokes unless you are very aware of what it means to be white, what it means to be not white, and the popularity of the sites and the consistency with which racist jokes are passed down. I would have to say that shows a great degree of conscious behavior on the part of white people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And I still say that there's a lot of what white people do where they don't think that they're being conscious about their race or anyone else's race. So it becomes difficult. I think it's probably likely that if you interviewed people who are going to those racist joke sites, even going to the white supremacist sites that I study, they would say that in the rest of their life they're not, they just do this thing on the internet for 20 minutes a day, and the rest of their life they're not consciously, trying to damage anyone else. I disagree with that, but I think that that's what most would say.
I guess this is why we raised the issue with, I guess, as Dr. Ali calls it, the racism 1.0, racism
right.
2.0. In the racism 2.0 era, you're supposed to say, oh, no, I'm not racist. I don't see color at all. President Obama's doing great. I voted for him. Did you see my sticker? I voted for him.
Right.
That's what you're supposed to say on the front stage. Backstage, whole different story. I thoroughly enjoyed the program. I think I hope this was constructive. It might not have been, but I hope it was constructive. Do you have anything you would like to promote? Any books coming out soon that we should look for?
No, that's it. I appreciate the time and interest in my work.
Outstanding. You can check her out at racismreview.com. She and Dr. Jill Fagan post there, racismreview.com. Our guest for today's program, admitted racist, white supremacist, Dr. Jessie Daniels. Thank you so much for your time, and we will be in touch.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you. We'll take a quick commercial. Everybody that's listening in, thank you. Quick commercial, and we will be right back. Context of white supremacy. Very interesting program. We'll be right back. Thank you for tuning in.
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At CounterRacism.com, you can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity, using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open-source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by counterracism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
Greetings, context of white supremacy, Gus T Renegade and Justice. I was just telling one of our non-white listeners, this felt very much like a throwback program. This felt like a year ago when it was only white people covered on the cows. This felt very much like one of those programs. But I guess the program with Thomas DeWolf last week or the week before, I guess that was somewhat similar. But I hope it was constructive. We have a lot of folks on the line. I want to make sure I promote Cree's program, Counter-Racist Evolving Engineer. Her next program will be Wednesday, March 31st, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 6:30 p.m. Central, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. Dr. William Darity, Duke University, very constructive. Right here, Blog Talk Radio, Counter-Racist Evolving Engineer. I am deferring to the guest who is furthest away for today's program. Dr. Ali, pleasure to have you back on the program. You were with us when I believe Michael Bradley was on the program last year. If you have anything you would like to share about what you heard from Dr. Daniels or anything else racism related, feel free. Before you do go, I just want to check because I might lose my switchboard. 916, if you have if you're able to chat without speakerphone, I can turn your mic on. Are you able to do so, or you just want to listen?
I need about 10 minutes before I can.
Okay. I will turn your mic on. If you can mute yourself, that would be great. Groovy. Thank you, sir. And the other 111, I got you. You're on. So everybody's on. And 404, I will even turn your mic on. Mute yourself, please, if you are in an environment that has a lot of noise or what have you, but I will turn your mic on so you can chat with us if you have anything you want to share down the road. So you're on 404. And Dr. Ali, take it away, sir.
Thanks a lot, Gus. I wish I'd had a little bit more time in the program to point listeners to material. But it's available anyway on the Bandung 2 blog. In particular, there's an article on there I wrote in, I think it was November 2008, entitled Copyright Equals Right to Copy White. And there is essentially a review of an article which appeared in the journal Theory, Culture and Society in 2006, an article entitled Copyright by Anne Barron, who's a reader in law at the London School of Economics, the LSE in the UK. And the interesting thing about that article is that it really does, if you look at it through a counter-racist lens, and if you read it translating, using the area of language, if you read it translating the terminology into counter-racist terminology, speaks volumes. I just like, if I can I read one or two extracts, very brief extracts?
Sorry about that. I had my mic off. Feel free to share. We have time. The broadcast is still going. People are going to hear all of this uninterrupted when they tune into the program. So if you think it's constructive, feel free to share.
Great. Thanks a lot. Okay. Well, according to Barron, that's the author of this article, she says that the modern institution of copyright dates back to the English Statute of Anne in 1710. This was the 1710 Act, an act for the encouragement of learning. This means that copyright did not exist before the 18th century. She goes on to state that the original individuated, complete, and inviolable work presupposed by copyright law is certainly specific to a particular time and location, the modern West. Now, she then goes on to say that the copyright systems of the world, so now we're shifting from, if you like, one particular region of the world to the world as a whole. The copyright systems of the world are generally understood as falling into two broad categories. The Anglo-American, with its understanding of copyright as an instrument for incentivizing, or if you like, stimulating, the production and dissemination of cultural goods. And the other copyright system is the civilian. So we've got the Anglo-American and the civilian, with its understanding of the author's rights as founded in the natural autonomy of the human creator. However, in practice, these differences have counted for little as economic forces marshaled by the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and its client states of the industrialized West have pushed national intellectual property regimes towards ever closer alignment during the last decade or so. Now, this is really important because essentially what she's saying is that there really is no difference between Anglo-American and civilian law vis-a-vis copyright. Copyright's global, but the reach of that copyright law is the reach of the West, which essentially means the reach of racism, white supremacy. So in that sense, copyright truly is copyright. And I define that as the right afforded by white people to copy them in their behavior and or any of the products of their behavior. And that could include something a complete range of cultural products. So copyright is essentially the rights afforded not by a neutral system to protect individuals and their creative acts. I mean, that is the, if you like, the overt face of copyright. But the the covert face, if you want to use Miss Daniels' language in talking in terms of cloaking, behind the reality of copyright, a mechanism by which to prevent people, specifically non-white people, the victims of racism, white supremacy, from gaining access to materials which may be of constructive value for them. And the reason I'm bringing this up, apart from the, if you like, specific case of my recent exchange with Ms. Daniels vis-a-vis the posting of a link to an online version of her book by a third party, that was a specific context. But the broader context is the whole issue of control, access, dissemination, circulation. And my feeling is that Ms. Daniels was being deceitful when she discussed with me this issue, in saying that she would potentially have a rethink about this issue, or think again about this issue, or perhaps in a future book or something like that, she would consider this again. Because for somebody who claims, as she does in the book, to be drawing together two strands of experience, if you like, of knowledge that generally aren't brought together. On the one hand, if you like, you have the whole issue of cyber culture, the internet, the World Wide Web, etc. And on the other hand, you have purportedly racism and what she refers to as anti-racism, whatever that term means. She claims that in her work, in this book, Cyber Racism, that she's actually bringing together these two strands for consideration. And yet, if that is truly the case, and she really is savvy with developments in the whole area of the internet, the World Wide Web, publishing, etc., then clearly she must be familiar with the notion of the Creative Commons and the idea that one can retain the rights digitally for electronic circulation of products. And I refuse to believe that, this is a simple lack of awareness or understanding on her part.
Dr. Jessie Daniels, admitted racist white supremacist. I strongly suspect she was practicing racism, white supremacy in, requesting or asking you to remove the material from your website. If she was really interested in replacing white supremacy with justice as soon as possible, I would think she would want her material to get out as wide and as far as possible by anyone who can read. Please read my book and help stop racism right now. I would think that would be her attitude.
Could I respond to that?
Please, sir.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that observation. And I also think that what is really going on here is a game of some form, because essentially what happened as a result of her posting that comment to the blog post which contained a link to her work was I followed up with a post essentially raising all the points that I raised this evening, and there was no counter response follow-up from her. Instead, what happened the following day, I received an email from blog.co.uk, the development team, essentially saying that I was in breach of copyright. I had 24 hours to remove the offending material or the account will be suspended. I then asked them, okay, how do you want me to comply? And essentially got the same information. I removed the link and then found out that the blog account was suspended, even though I had removed the link. So I then contacted the team after receiving another email from them informing me that if I wish the blog to be reactivated, I should provide evidence that I had complied with their request. I did so, and then it was reactivated. Now, this isn't a major crisis in the sense that it was a 24-hour cessation of activity and access to the blog. But what it does demonstrate to me is the asymmetry in the power relations regarding control and ownership of information. I mean, you yourself, Gus, you run the Victim of Racism Diary, which is a blog as well. And as you are probably well aware, non-white people did not create the internet, nor did they create the World Wide Web, nor do they own the internet and or the World Wide Web, nor do they control access to the internet and or World Wide Web. All of these structures, both in terms of how they were established, how they are maintained, how they are expanded, and or how they are refined, fall under the control and ownership and power of members of the system of racism, white supremacy, that is, white people. And so the blogosphere, in which the Bandung 2 blog, the Victim of Racism Diary, and other non-white counter-racist bloggers and other non-white people and white people exist, is a space dominated in exactly the same way that the existential space of the known universe is dominated, i.e., by the system of racism, white supremacy.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I hope that non-white people get a better understanding of that and what that means. Tuning into this broadcast, going to Bandung 2, Cree's website, counter-racism.com. I hope these materials help non-white people get a better understanding of what it means to be on a planet dominated by white supremacy. The other folks who called in, Dr. Ali, if you have time or interest, I would love it if you could hang out and share with the other folks who called in. If anyone who called in, if you have comments on what Dr. Daniel shared, on what Dr. Ali shared with us, anything you would like to share, feel free. Everyone who called in, your mic is open. So that would be 916, Non-Mighty Wick, 404, I believe that's Love, Truth, Liberation, Mr. 720, and whomever called in at the last minute, your number showing up as 111. You are all on the line, and Dr. Ali as well, and Tater Pie, you're also with us.
Okay, in this interval of silence,
hello, can I be heard?
Could I just? Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, you can be heard. I believe that's Mr. Nero. We can hear you.
Oh, yes, it is. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear most of the show because I was working, so I heard bits and pieces of it. I will download the archive and listen to it. But can you please expound upon? She talked about a little bit about gender oppression, I believe, at one point in the show, or the lack thereof it, or it not being significant.
I believe what she said is that feminism and I guess what they call homophobia, these other isms that people talk about when they are discussing racism, white supremacy, that these can easily be grafted onto white supremacy, meaning that people can easily talk about feminism and what a problem that is while practicing white supremacy. And the same thing is applicable for people who talk about how so-called gay and lesbian individuals have a tough time and are mistreated systematically, that can be done while practicing racism, white supremacy. She had a specific passage in her book that I think eloquently illustrates this. She said that Stormfront illustrates another way in which white supremacy is inherent in white identity. This suggests something troubling about liberal feminism, to the extent that liberal feminism articulates a limited vision of gender equality, Without challenging racial inequality, white feminism is not inconsistent with white supremacy. Without an explicit challenge to racism, white feminism is easily grafted onto white supremacy and useful for arguing for equality for white women and possibly for white gays and lesbians within a white supremacist context. I thought that was excellent, and she did elaborate on that passage on the program.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing.
Could I say one thing in regards to that?
Go right ahead, sir.
One thing I've noticed is that a number of so-called white anti-racists, and I'm specifically pointing to people like Tim Wise, Robert Jensen, and now Jessie Daniels, that there's a tendency to practice what I call conflationism, which is to bring together a number of strands under this umbrella of what they refer to as oppression in order to, as it were, deal with three issues at once. So, for example, you'll often find in books like The Heart of Whiteness, which is Robert Jensen's book, mention of heterosexism or straight supremacy alongside male supremacy and or masculinism, and put in the same context as racism, white supremacy. And I feel that, I'm not suggesting here that there aren't other forms of oppression and or injustice other than the globally operating system of racism, white supremacy. I'm agnostic on that for the time being. What I'm suggesting, though, is that this may be a strategy of liberal, i.e. refined white supremacist racists to, as it were, deflate and divert attention away from the issue. I mean, I was listening very closely during the discussion to how a number of different issues were drawn into the discussion. For example, issues to do with so-called nationalism, to do with democracy, and then obviously mentions of, if you like, gender, feminism, heteronormativity, although that wasn't mentioned, the implication that there was some form of, if you like, discrimination against so-called gay and or lesbian people. But my feeling is that this is a strategy, and this strategy keeps surfacing, particularly amongst white so-called liberal anti-racists, so-called progressive types. But, and this is another interesting thing, in her book, there's almost a kind of tacit connection, a hidden connection between conservative values and or racist white supremacist values. But as we know, it's quite possible to be a liberal racist. And in fact, I mean, certainly if you follow the line of thinking of an important counter-racist theorist such as Neely Fuller, you'd have to argue that the most refined and sophisticated form of racism, white supremacy, is the liberal form of racism, white supremacy. And so I get not concerned, but I am interested to look at how conflationism functions as a strategic tool on the part of suspected racists. And so that's the kind of way I was looking at how that issue was dealt with.
Uh, 720, I know you said you were confused by some of the commentary that Dr. Daniel shared, and I think you picked out inconsistencies between either things she wrote in her book or the way she responded to questions. Can you share, I guess, a little bit about how she confused you or what you were confused about?
Well, yeah, and I'd like to say that the information that Dr. Ali gave has been very helpful for me, very useful. I'll keep it in mind. I think particularly when she was talking about white people being unconscious. And when she agreed that Google and Facebook and other sites were indeed more white supremacist than, say, nigger jokes and other sites like that. And she agreed. And I'm not exactly sure how you put it, but when you said how she's diverting attention from just the typical, regular, run-of-the-mill white person and diverting the attention to the Klansmen, people like that, those kinds of white supremacists. And with my confusion coming up, it was a bit difficult to try to not let my emotions essentially start talking to me and say, what is she talking about? What is she talking about? And it did indeed border on insanity to me. But one thing that is becoming more and more useful for me as a result of all of this is that, and I don't mean just a little insane, it's insane, that's become useful, is that just like with these movies, I'm starting to really apply my imagination, which becomes extremely tied in with reality anymore. And I do see the chains around my neck and around my legs and on my arms, and as I'm asking questions of people like Dr. Daniels, I am not uncertain in any way that, as what I said to her, and I think that was a perfect illustration, she smugly, or in a very refined way, comes up and while the lynch mob is her white supremacist sites, so to speak, are getting ready to lynch the nigger, she comes up and hopes that the nigger doesn't see her handing David Duke the noose. She hopes that she doesn't. And then she turns around, which essentially is what was happening on the program, and she says, oh, my God, he's about to hang the nigger. Please don't hang the nigger. I'm here. I don't want you to hang the nigger. It's just insanity. And so if I constantly remember that these chains are still binding me, and like I say, it comes to my imagination and reality merge, then I look at her, as you say, every bit with all the intensity that I can in a suspicious manner.
She's an admitted racist. The description for the program, the description of the program will be changed to reflect that. Admitted racist, white supremacist. Keep that. And she even, I don't remember the exact point, but when she was squabbling over some aspect, it was over the point of that's what the white racial frame means, her eventually conceding, yes, it means that white people worldwide see non-white people as individuals who should be dominated and mistreated. When she was squabbling about that before she conceded, she said it could be that I'm practicing racism right now. I would highly encourage any non-white person, when you listen to these shows, I don't care who the white person is, I don't care what their book is about, you should be thinking this person is probably racist. I don't care if it's Tim Wise, Dr. Martin Kevorkian, who I think has a lot of constructive information. He's an admitted racist. It's in the description, admitted racist. Tim Wise, admitted racist. A lot of these people have admitted it on the show, so that's what you should be thinking. You should not come into the program thinking that these people are going to, say the correct thing and that they have your best interest in mind. You should have in mind that they're going to come and make an effort to say confusing things and to try to throw you off so that you're not suspicious when they come on these programs, when they write these books. So please keep that in mind. That's why I say admitted racist. When they say that, I try to repeat that, so you'll keep that in mind. Admitted racist. Dr. Jessie Daniels, admitted racist.
Could I also say that I think the whole premise of that book, Cyber Racism, is essentially a non-starter. I mean, the whole idea of looking at, if you like, less refined racism, it's just like, it's like focusing on the Aryan nations or the Ku Klux Klan and not understanding racism, white supremacy at all. Because I know this, in the UK, when I talk to people about racism, white supremacy, and in a UK context, people immediately think I'm talking about the British National Party, or what used to be known as the National Front. And when I then explain, no, this is a global system of power relations, and it's based on a sociopolitical construct called race, which itself is based on color and or factors associated with color, then it takes people a while to understand that. But it seems to me that given that it's difficult to even get people to understand that the term racism has been co-opted and its meaning has been, if you like, narrowed to focus on what we might want to differentiate and refer to as crude or overt thuggery, if you like, that type of racism, a subset of the, if you like, global system, then I think all the effort really needs to be focusing on racism in general, white supremacy in general, the refined, liberal, invisible, transparent, ubiquitous, pervasive form of racism, hence me referring to it as cyber racism 2.0, just to essentially buy into some of the kind of cyber rhetoric and language that's floating around at the moment. But, you know, from my perspective, and, you know, those were the initial thoughts I had when I came across the book. I flicked through it, I looked at the contents page, I went through some of the chapters, very briefly skimming them. I looked at the list of books she consulted in her bibliography. I looked at the index. And, for example, she references Jack Goldsmith and Timothy Wu's book, Who Controls the Internet, which I recommend every non-white person should go out and get a hold of that book from a library, or if you can afford it, buy a copy. If not, try to find an electronic copy online from some non-white website that's prepared to host it, and study that book closely, putting on your counter-racist glasses, and read between the lines, because that book will contribute constructive information in a way that I think cyber racism doesn't. Cyber racism, in my opinion, is nothing other than a distraction. It is, in fact, a waste of time for victims, from one perspective. From another perspective, it's also highly constructive because it is an example of how a purported white anti-racist scholar activist can divert attention away from the real issue, which is racism, white supremacy in its refined liberal form. So that was my first point. It was essentially to dunk the book from one perspective, but also to venerate it from another perspective. The other point I wanted to raise was I found it interesting during the conversation that it was almost as if Gus was playing the role of, as it were, instructor, teaching a purported scholar activist anti-racist what racism, white supremacy is. And it was almost as if I could see her taking down notes and possibly recording the conversation to provide material for the next book. And the reality, unless I'm completely misinformed, is that Miss Daniels is a tenured professor. She's on a salary. She does this for a living. She gets paid. I found that very interesting.
Yes, you can be heard. You might want to speak up a little bit.
No, I'm done.
Oh, I thought there was someone else. Was it Mr. Nero, 720, Love, Truth, Liberation? I know someone called in kind of late. If you have any comments, questions.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Hey, how you doing, Gus?
I'm well, sir. How are you?
Same old. Dr. Ali, you said that the book was a non-starter. I was curious, what do you think the purpose of such a book is? I mean, like you said, it's a non-starter, but on the other side, do you see it as, well, you said it's a deflection. Do you also see it as possibly advertisement?
Do you mean advertisement, if you like, in the sense of a message being passed from a white person to another white person? Do you mean it in that sense? Or do you mean it in the sense of simple promotion for material gain?
Both, but the first one, the message between, that's more what I meant.
Okay, well, I think that there's definitely something to that. I think you're onto something with that. I think we have to potentially consider multiple functions associated with any artifact or any product, if you like, of a suspected white supremacy. So a book is put out there. What is the purpose of the book? What is the function of the book? Okay, overtly, the book is about white supremacy, racism in the internet era. Okay, that's the, if you like, the overt face of the book. At another level, the book functions as a distraction from refined liberal racism, white supremacy. But as you pointed out, and I think I would agree with you, at another level, there's yet another function to the book, and that function is, if you like, a kind of a communication between those able to receive the message. So a communication from a white person to other white people. In the same way that there are texts, films, which have multiple functions. I mean, the most overt being simply to generate revenue, material gain. That's the most crass. But the other functions, I think, are all there. Conflation is one that I personally see quite rampant in texts written by white anti-racists. And by conflation, I mean drawing racism alongside sexism, heterosexism, and various other forms of ism, such as classism, etc., etc., and thereby obscuring the central issue of racism, white supremacy as the global system in which sex functions as a subsystem. You see, my view is that the liberal white anti-racists, the so-called progressives, are essentially trying to draw out multiple strands and, as it were, put these strands into alignment as if they were on par. The effect that has is to deflate racism as white supremacy into racism as simply one ism competing amongst others. Yeah?
Yeah, I agree with that. That makes a lot of sense. Because, I was just thinking about, like you said, the purpose of the book. You know what I'm saying? And I looked at it as like you said, a communication between them, and as advertisement in a way where she's kind of getting the information out in her own way. The different websites and whatnot. So yeah, I would agree.
It's very, very difficult. You know, I mean, I've spoken to other non-white counter-racists in the UK about this issue, and the problem is discerning intent is close to impossible between any two human beings, whether you're dealing with white and non-white, non-white and non-white. You're talking about trying to understand motive, to infer intent. And from a counter-racist perspective, my understanding is that we simply, under conditions of globally operating racism, white supremacy, we have to suspect white people as potentially functional racist white supremacists. But it is incorrect, so at least on, for example, Neely Fuller's conception of counter-racist thought, speech, and or action. It is incorrect to automatically assume or infer that a white person is necessarily a functional racist and or white supremacist. But given that we have to deal with the information that we can have access to, in other words, we cannot have access to intent, to motive, it is prudent, it is wise for us to adopt a mode of speech, thought, and or action wherein we are suspicious of everything. So we would have, on that basis, we would have to follow the kind of thinking and reasoning and logic that you're demonstrating in essentially saying that this book could function as communication amongst potential racist white supremacists. But I don't think it would be just and or correct to go further than that and to, as it were, collapse the possibility onto an actuality. In other words, to say, yeah, for sure, that's all the book was. The book was a communication amongst white supremacists. She was essentially advertising and promoting these overt, crude white supremacist sites. I don't think that would be correct, certainly not according to my understanding of counter-racist logic, but I could be incorrect. Would you like to respond?
I agree with what you said. I mean, like you said, there's no way to stamp down the intent. So, yeah, I wouldn't say that for sure. This is what the book was. I just was thinking, if it's a non-starter, there has to be some. Like if it's not constructive to non-white people, then I was just wondering, like, well, what is the intent? But yeah, your comments were duly noted.
The other folks that called in, if you had anything you wanted to share, I know Mr. Nero, if you had any comments, or 720, you're still with us. Love, Truth, and Liberation. If y'all had anything you wanted to share, feel free. You all still there? 720, Mr. Nero, Love, Truth, Liberation. Did you all exit, or you still there? Or did you have nothing more to add?
This is 720. I'm still here, Renegade.
Okay. So.
This is Mr. Nero. I'm still here also. Okay. It's just that I'm at a disadvantage because, I missed major bits and pieces of the show because I was at work, but I have, you know, the little bit that I caught was very interesting, and I thought that I do believe I heard her say that she felt that all white people were racist. Did she make that statement?
Yes.
Okay. I thought that was important, and you know, I appreciate when white people do at least come on the show and make that statement, because I think it allows me personally to take everything else with a grain of salt and with suspicion once they have made that statement that they are in fact a racist and that all white people are racist.
Could I comment briefly on that?
I'm surrounded by suspected racists right now, so I can't really participate too much in this conversation, but it is definitely good to continue to underscore the fact that white people are all racist suspects or racist, and I suspect that they're all racist.
I'd like to briefly comment on this alleged revealing remark or opening statement of a number of white people who've come on the C.O.W.S previously, in particular Martin Kevorkian, Tim Wise, I think Robert Jensen, and this evening Jessie Daniels. This kind of public admission to being a racist, I feel is a very sophisticated strategy for confusing victims. I'm sure everyone's aware of that, so it's not as if I'm saying something, you know, radically enlightening here. But I think it's important that we remind ourselves that although logic is essentially binary in some form, you know, like truth, falsehood, right, wrong, up and down, as it were, that there are layers and layers and layers of position and counter-position and counter-counter-position, etc., etc. And I sometimes have this feeling that these admissions are strategic. They serve a deep functional purpose, which is essentially for non-white people, essentially forms of deceit, technology, confusion, deceit, and also distractions. I mean, I would be generally much more prepared to listen to what a white person had to say if they were at least defending themselves in some way. I am not convinced by these blanket admissions of participation in this system. I feel there's something strategic to this.
Hello, Gus?
Yes, sir.
Let me add on to what he just said. When you said it was this show was kind of a throwback show, and I must admit that it was kind of confusing for me at times. And, you know, the doctor is saying that it's a strategy. I see that in a way, because it was confusing at times listening to the discussion, because she would concede to some of the things that you were saying, but it's like she didn't go further and say that she will now change her, you know, her teaching or her writing in accordance to what she had conceded. So it's like, you know, if you're waiting for a punchline or something like that, it never comes. Yeah, I found that a little confusing, and I found that your comment on it being a throwback, possibly throwback show, I can see what you were saying as far as that. You understand what I'm saying?
I suspect that the punchline is that will be maintaining white supremacy. Dr. Ali, can I ask you a question? When
Sure.
you say that you're not convinced, I guess I didn't quite clearly hear what it is you're not convinced of.
Okay, I'm not convinced by these public displays of self-affirmation of racism, white supremacy. I'm not convinced when a very public white so-called anti-racist comes on a show like the C.O.W.S. and opening line is, when asked, do you believe that white people are racist? I don't buy it when the response is, yes, white people are racist. All white people are racist, and that would have to include me. It's almost as if it's like ripping the carpet from underneath your feet. It's like, okay, I've admitted to this. What more do you want? The rest of it is just window dressing. And you talk about it in terms of the punchline. I think that's precisely it. I would be much more interested to listen to a white person who really didn't buy into this at all, who had studied race, whatever the formulation of that construct, and was not prepared to concede that they themselves were a racist. I mean, I know Tim Wise constantly fluctuates between, yes, I am a racist, while at the same time there's another part of me that is anti-racist. So it's not as simple as that, although it was very interesting. I think it was on the last show that he was on, which I think Gus managed to clarify the issue by forcing Tim Wise to concede that, okay, you may not be consciously functioning as a racist, but you may be committed to the oppression of non-white people unconsciously. In other words, in the sense that racism, white supremacy as a power system has become so sedimented, so embedded deeply into the, as it were, culture of the global power system, that it's no longer in the conscious. It's, if you like, it's bedded down into the unconscious, the subconscious. Yeah? Am I making myself clear or not?
Dr. Ali, if I may respond, sir, this is Mr. Nero.
Go ahead.
I keep it pretty simple for myself. And once a white person admits to me that they are a racist, then I take that at face value. At that point, everything else that comes after that, because I see white supremacy as being anti-human. And so everything that comes after that is just trying to prove that they are, in fact, a human being, in my estimation. So for me, once I hear that, because most of the white people in my area of the world will not say that they are a racist. She's, to me, the few that have come on this show and have admitted to it are the only people I've ever heard admit to it. The white people in my area of the world have never said that they are racist. In fact, they all come the other way. I'm not a racist, or I'm not prejudiced. That's usually how it goes. So for me, I just keep it pretty simple and on face value. Once they admit it, hey, that's it. you can stand in line right here with the rest of them.
Okay, I understand where you're coming from.
Hang on 1 second. I think somebody else had a comment. I don't know who it was.
It's 7-2. I just wanted to comment on Mr. Nero's comment in terms of what he said about them. I think he said something to the extent that they could be inhuman. There was a quote by
anti-human.
Anti-human. Okay. There was a quote by Harriet Tubman, and this was in Dr. Africa's book on Nutricide, and he says, if a person, Caucasian, would send another African into bondage, slavery, he would, it appears to me, be bad enough to send him to hell if he could. So for me,
could I
yes,
sorry.
Dr. Ali. Yes, Dr. Ali.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead. I'll follow up after.
Oh, just quickly again, for me, even with intent, if, as I said earlier, I simply remember, and this I think applies to what Mr. Nero said in some ways, if I simply let my imagination tell me and merge with my reality that I have chains on my mind, on my neck, my hands, and my legs, no matter what refinement they come at me with, it means nothing, because I'm simply looking, saying, yeah. Now what you going to do about getting these chains off of us permanently? And until that happens, all the refinement that they talk about, I'm not diverted if I can simply keep that in mind. I've got these chains on me. You're talking yak, yakety, yak. None of that talk is taking these chains off of me. What you going to do about it?
We are almost out of time on the program. Dr. Ali, can you give out the website for Bandung 2, please, sir?
I can do, indeed. The Bandung 2 blog is Bandung 2, that's BANDUNG 2, bandung2.blog.co.uk. And the Bandung 2 website itself is www.bandung2.co.uk.
Outstanding. It is also linked. If you are lazy like me, it is linked right here at the COWS show page, the Bandung 2 blog. Right there, you can just click it and it'll take you to his website. Thank you for participating, calling all the way from the UK. Great to get your input on the program. And everybody else who called in, thank you. Mr. Nero, Mr. 720, Love, Truth, and Liberation, Tater Pie, thank you. And gentlemen, I believe 909 also called in. Again, Cree's program will be this Wednesday, March 31st. Dr. William Darity, Duke University. That is Wednesday, I guess depending on where you are, Wednesday evening if you're on the East Coast, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. If you're on the West Coast, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. I guess my final thought, I hope that people do not think that the white people who come on this program are committed to replacing white supremacy with justice, because I certainly do not think that way, that these white folks are going to do anything to end this system. These programs are an opportunity for non-white people to hear white people speak about and or practice racism, white supremacy, so that you can study. Hopefully they'll share constructive information, and you can study their behavior on the program. I, too, can say that I hadn't really heard a lot of white people admit to being racist before doing this program. I think a lot of other non-white people, they haven't heard white people admit that there's a system of white supremacy. They haven't heard white people admit to being racist. I think there's a value for non-white people hearing a white person say truthfully, yes, I'm a part of this system. Our goal is to mistreat all of you non-white folks forever. I think there's a value to that. Hang on one second. Yeah, I think there's a value to that, and at the same time, I hope that non-white people do not confuse that with thinking these white people are going to do something to replace white supremacy with justice, because I don't think their conduct on these programs has demonstrated that at all. Tim Wise, Jessie Daniels, any of the other folks, their conduct has not demonstrated that. But I do think it is constructive. It might not be. Folks, if they don't think it is, as I've said before, don't listen to the broadcast. Dr. Ali, I will, as I said, the email, we will see about getting you on a show so that you will have more time to share your views on racism, white supremacy. You can share more of the content from your website, articles, things of that nature. We will get a time and date nailed down so that you can come back and share more information with us. Would that be agreeable?
That will be agreeable. Thank you very much for the invite.
Outstanding. Context of White Supremacy. We'll be back Thursday, April 1st, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. We'll be right back. Context of White Supremacy. Replace white supremacy with justice as soon as possible. Thank you for tuning in.